effective city and building planning or lack thereof have received increased attention. According to Xolela Mangcu, professor of sociology and history at the George Washington University, our cities will be doomed unless there is a significant change in the way they are planned. He joins us now to discuss this further. Prof, good afternoon. Welcome to today, and thank you very much for your time. You make a very strong case in your opinion piece about the need for planning, or what you call a major haul in how our cities planned, if we are to avoid more infernos. Currently, you argue we are focusing on the wrong things.
Well, yeah, we are missing the forest for the trees, quite frankly, by focusing on individual buildings and what kind of maintenance has to be done. At the bottom of it, it should be about how you actually plan the city. At the heart of city planning is, of course, the idea of cities as social relations and social networks. Now, some of us have been making the argument since the 1990s that the way Johannesburg was planned post-1994 was disastrous, quite frankly. I mean, if you look at the inner city and the contrast with Sandton, for example, it's patently clear that you almost have two worlds apart. Sandton City, quite frankly, is horrific. I mean, it's almost like every little space has to be filled with a building. Terrible architecture, I might also add. But this is at the expense of the city planning that would have happened in Johannesburg downtown, where citizens were supposed to be at the center of planning. Had you had citizens at the center of planning in Johannesburg, it is highly unlikely you would have buildings being hijacked, because citizens would have been at the heart of controlling what goes on in their neighborhoods.
Is that what you mean by that when planning cities, when you take into consideration social networks?
Exactly. I mean, if you go back in the history of planning, there have basically been two traditions. One tradition has ended to the kind of situation we have in Johannesburg, where the focus is on physical design. The other tradition with which I'd like to associate myself is the idea of cities based on the idea of urban citizenship. Now, I've studied planning, I've studied various models of planning, and cities that have been successful around the world are those in which citizens are not just consulted, but they are actually at the heart of the planning process. When you have that, for example, you have cities that are designed around public spaces where children can play, where the environment is conducive to the growth and development of people, not just buildings. The building-centered approach to city planning is outmoded. It belongs to a tradition of planning that has quite frankly failed over the decades.
Are there good examples you can share with our viewers where that has happened successfully?
Well, the best example, I suppose, was the subject of my PhD in city planning. And that example was Chicago and its first Black mayor, Harold Washington. And Washington is now recognized as a pioneer in kind of like the kind of planning I'm talking about, where individual citizens are at the forefront. The result, of course, is people like Barack Obama, Michelle Obama, Valerie Jarrett, right? They came out of that process, that human-centered approach to planning, where you allow individuals, right, to kind of be apprentices in their own development, in their own leadership, and they're able to give direction to their environments, to their neighborhoods, to the broader city, and that allows people to emerge as responsible managers of their own cities.
The example you've given now about Chicago, which was the subject of your PhD thesis, means or presupposes there has to be existence of political will by the current leadership. And I don't know if we have that in Johannesburg, for example, that we're talking about the city of gold.
Well, we haven't had that political will for over decades now. I mean, I was making these arguments in the 1990s. I brought out a book called Emerging Johannesburg, together with my colleagues Richard Tomlinson, who actually was my professor of planning at WITS, and Robert Beauregard and Lindsay Bremner. And that book, the title itself, Emerging Johannesburg, was suggesting that the city was not complete and we had an opportunity to actually plan it in the way that I've explained with respect to Chicago. But it's not only Chicago. You go to cities around the world. You know, you go to Boston in the United States, but you go to places like Sheffield in the UK. You go to India, you go to Brazil, a place like Porto Alegre. Citizens are at the heart of those cities, and those cities have thrived.
Yeah, thank you very much for your time. You make a very good argument there. Hopefully one day, or maybe after elections next year, somebody might listen to what you've been saying since the 90s. Thank you very much, Prof. That's Xolela Mangcu, Professor of Sociology and History at the George Washington University.